Well, this is a perfect time to be talking about diversity. My name's Rebecca Lewis. I'm the managing partner of Arisaig Partners. It's the end of a month of Pride celebrations. We are also in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement that has now gone global. We've also had a momentous vote very recently on LGBTQ rights in America. It is now not possible to discriminate against people because of their sexual orientation, which is a huge step forward. So the backdrop surely is one of optimism for change on diversity and inclusion, but obviously that gets a little bit tempered by the idea that we're still having conversations about an equitable society and the importance of that. From an Arisaig Partners perspective, it's purely a common sense perspective. We are emerging markets investors, and there are 6 billion people in emerging markets. And by the law of probabilities, there are going to be every dimension of diversity catered for within those 6 billion people occupying those markets. Also, for us as a firm, we're very long-term investors. So we're interested in the now, but we're perhaps more interested in the future. We look ahead 20 years in terms of our investment approach. So it matters what's happening today, but it matters on the aspirations of those 6 billion people and where they want to take their country into the future. Our investment approach is a buy and hold one. We like to get to know businesses really well, and when we buy them, we aim to hold them forever. So the biggest risk is that we all get the same groupthink. We all start to think the same way. So as an organization, we have to continue to challenge ourselves to ensure that we have the most diverse workforce that not only reflects the markets that we're investing in, but challenge, so we can challenge each other and bring different experiences to bear. We're also a research house, and unfortunately the research, doesn't always tell us what we want to hear. Alice Townsend, one of our members of the team based from London, did a piece of work on gender equality in emerging markets, and within our portfolio holding, there's only 17% of the senior management teams are women. That's not a great figure, but it's perhaps even more alarming for us as investors when we think about the consumers in these markets, in these emerging markets. We would estimate that over 75% of consumption decisions are made by women. So you've got management teams that don't reflect women, and you've got women making those consumption decisions, then that's not a great place to be. Interestingly, only 5% of our holdings are led by women as their CEO. So what's our role in the world? Well, it's to move forward the conversation, to do our bit, to challenge ourselves, to challenge our holdings, to take steps forward. And in that regard, the engagement work that we do with our holdings is a key part of our investment approach. We like to then share that best practice, that leadership with other investee companies with the hope that we can all move forward together. And that will be to the benefit of our investors, because they'll be holding truly the best consumer businesses in the emerging world. So with that introduction, today's webinar is focused on diversity, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Nisa Godrej to the call today. She's the CEO and chairperson of Godrej Consumer Products. We believe this is an emerging market champion, and currently is a global business, having started off as a soap business in India. So welcome, Nisa.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you here again.
We're also delighted to welcome Parmesh Sahani. He has the enviable title of being head of the Godrej Consumer Culture Lab. And I think with a title like that, it gives you a sense of how importantly the company takes the topic of organizational culture. So thank you so much, Parmesh, also for joining us today.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. Great. So let's get stuck in. We've been investors in Godrej for 20 years now, well, nearly 20 years. And, I kind of mentioned in the introduction, started off as a soaps business, but now you're across so many countries around the world, Nisa, selling a wide range of fast-moving consumer goods products. Now, it's really interesting for us as investors when we always sit down with the organization, with actually a wide range of members of the organization, to talk about strategy and where you're taking the business. It always ends, always drills back to values. And very often in our conversation, it ends up, focused on diversity and the importance of people in the organization. So perhaps to kick off, you can just give us a sense of why this is.
I think, Rebecca, it's really about the history of the Godrej Group. So you mentioned Godrej Consumer Products as the company. Actually, its first product was soaps, and we started making soap during the flu of 1918. But the history of Godrej is even further back than that, and we actually started in India's freedom movement as part of Mahatma Gandhi's Swadeshi, the idea of Make in India. And most of our profits at the time went back to the freedom movement. So I think as a business, this idea of people, planet, profit has always sort of been strongly intertwined with the Godrej Group. So if you come to our headquarters in Bombay, you see we maintain mangroves 3.5 times the size of Central Park. So I think this idea of people and planet is very, very close to our heart. I think diversity is a part of that, correct? Being inclusive, being diverse is a part of that, and for two reasons, correct? One is obviously it just makes business sense, like you said. If we don't reflect the world around us and how it's changing, and if those people are not sitting on the leadership table, you are going to at some point be left behind. And I think this social justice, this idea of equality and inclusivity, and that we should only be judged for our tenacity and hard work, and not for our gender, our sexuality, anything else. So I think this is just very closely held in our hearts down generations.
Yeah. And one of the kind of interviews I've seen, actually, I was really compelled by this idea, and I'm going to completely mess this pronunciation up now, but of anti-vaccine. Can you talk a bit about this? Because I found it just a really interesting way of thinking about progress.
Yes. And I think an anti-vaccine is it's a Sanskrit word, and it describes someone who lived at the border. So, in the olden days, you talked about people who would get nirvana, moksha, or this enlightenment by going to the forest. But here was a fellow, I'd like to think maybe a woman, who had one foot in the forest, which was moving ahead, getting enlightenment, and the other foot was still firmly planted in the village. And I think if you sort of bring it to modern day Godrej, it's that our values should stay fixed. Our values that we were formed as part of a freedom movement, our values that the climate really matters, our footprint matters, that should never change, correct? Maybe it'll adapt to the day and the times of what we have to stand up for, but our business should always keep changing, correct? So how do you change your business every 5 years, but how do you always hold on to who you are and your values?
No, spot on. And it's kind of interesting when we were talking last week about, doing this, and you're kind enough to set aside some time. I was all kind of prepped and ready to go with my business case. I was like, innovation rates, retention of people, become the employer of choice. I was like, we're kind of investors. So we're like, if we could put a number on that, it makes us feel way, way more comfortable.
Yeah.
I mean, when we spoke about that, though, you're kind of like, business case, you've heard it all before. I don't want to talk about the business case. Like, you feel like kind of came through that you're definitely a more moral case. I mean, how do you marry that when you're kind of CEO of a big business?
I think the case is definitely for both, correct? Because the business case is very strong, is that if you have everyone talking and looking like you, the innovation is just not going to happen, correct? And we're seeing that, especially now during COVID, especially because what the world is going through, you're going to see that even more so, correct? People will want these curves flattened. They've had enough of this. So I think diversity does help in innovation. I think that case study is being proved many times. I think what is the right thing to do is good for our hearts and souls, but it's also good for our business in the long run, correct? Investors like you, or the people we're able to attract to work for us, also come to us because they know of this long history of values and doing sort of what's right. So I think I don't think you can separate, here's the business case and here is the moral case, and we need to sort of argue them out separately. They're very intertwined, and it will be even more so now.
Agree. I mean, Parmesh, perhaps you want to pick up here actually, because it's, as Nisa was saying, you've researched this so widely. I mean, do you want to kick off just talking a little bit about the Culture Lab and how it's framed, but perhaps just to build on kind of what Nisa was just alluding to in terms of kind of marrying this moral case and the business case?
Completely agree that, and I think we have to do whatever it takes, because we are at this moment where, I mean, what I've done all my life within Godrej and even outside is, I mean, it's a no-brainer to me, being gay myself. Clearly, it's it's very moral to me that I work for an organization that respects me and treats me the same as it is for so many queer employees, for so many queer customers, and so on. But and sometimes if morality is something that with organizations, which is a sliding scale perhaps, then you use other things, right? Like inclusion makes you money, inclusion makes you more innovative, inclusion brings you more talent, improves your brand or whatever. So I use both. I use a combination of both, but really depends on who I'm talking to and depends on what I feel is going to help me get the impact that I want, which is, a more equal company, Godrej, where I'm working, more equal corporate India in general, and a more equal world. So to tell you a little bit about the Culture Lab, you spoke about Antivasan earlier. So the Godrej India Culture Lab is kind of like an experimental Antivasan space at Godrej that's been created as a public resource for the city of Mumbai and for India at large. We do three things broadly. We do year-round event programming, and that focuses on marginality, right? So what are the conversations that are not happening on contemporary India about identities, about multiple histories, about the environment, about urban-rural circularity, things like that. There's so much noise that happens in the mainstream, but we believe that, our future is going to be determined by how we address so many of these fundamental issues, right? So we try and work at the intersection of these issues by curating public events. Besides these kind of physical and online events, we've also, over the years, started doing fellowship programs for, mostly humanities, because we feel like these school students have lots of opportunities. But this is mostly for humanities students in Mumbai, in India, and actually from all around the world. So we have 3 levels of fellowship. We produce a lot of public resources. There's MumbaiCultureMap.com, which is 200 cultural institutes in the city. We've just finished something called Meme Project India. I don't know if you like memes, but this is both meme theory as well as a timeline of, fabulous Indian memes over the decades. So we kind of produce resources like this for the world. So everything we do is actually not just for Godrej. Godrej facilitates the lab, but it's really a resource for, anyone. And in terms of diversity, it just so happens that we just, over the past 9 years, we've just happened to do a lot of LGBTQ programming, as programming around gender and so many other things. And I think our programming has really, really helped shift the conversation at Godrej. So you can see, Godrej's journey towards specifically LGBTQ inclusion kind of began 9 years ago as well, when the lab started. And, we can talk about that later in terms of what it means to have these catalyzing forces. But that's just, what we do at the lab.
Yeah. It's kind of one of my favorite memories, actually, of being in India, was when we were hosted at the Godrej office, actually our team and some of our investors. And we got a little bit of Nisa's time. She does have a business to run, but stepped away to give us, a brief introduction to a broader event, talking about innovation and all the kind of, the product development activities. This was for our investors when they came to visit in Mumbai. And so I sat down in the hall, was kind of expecting a bit of the corporate speech, and kind of Nisa steps off in front of kind of 60, or so global investors, and starts a pretty kind of vibrant speech specifically on LGBTQ rights, which, to be honest, I wasn't expecting. So I secretly started recording this for my wife, to show her when I got home. But I mean, I think just to come back to you, Nisa, I mean, this was actually, I think this was in 2017. So this was before I think it became legal to be gay in India. I mean, can you just talk a little bit about why, CEOs tend to steer clear of polarizing issues? Like how, why be so vocal about this particular dimension of diversity?
I think again it goes back to saying, what does Godrej stand for and what are our values. So I think it's definitely from there. But I think the most important part for me was I'm Western educated, I'm very liberal, I come from a very egalitarian family where say in most Indian business families, if there was a son, the daughter's not really, given a role. In my family, there was no question, if anything, it's the opposite. The women really are treated as first and foremost. And then, I started working with Parmesh, and Parmesh actually came in to do this Godrej India Culture Lab, which is actually, it's not part of any of the companies. It's a separate thing that we support. It's actually it's like a non-profit. It's a resource for the city and India. And he actually, and obviously I've had, gay friends in my family. I've seen it, so it's not, totally supportive. But I never thought of it from a business lens. And he came in one day and he said, all our policies say spouse and not partner. And I said, no, I didn't. And why don't you tell HR to change it? So I think it started from someone actually noticing. And then, maybe there are lots of other people who had noticed before, but didn't have the voice or didn't sort of speak up. So, and I think it's an ongoing thing. I don't think it starts one year and then finishes the next year. So it's how do we, I remember, I think, Ramesh, was it in 2018 or 2019, where he wrote a white paper on transgenders in the workplace. And then he came to me and said, we need to do this gender reassignment surgery as part of insurance. And I was like, why? Why do we have to do that? And I don't think the why for me maybe it doesn't come from bias, but it comes from a lack of understanding. So, and I think that lack of understanding will always, I think I have a lack of understanding on what women go through, what a typical Indian woman goes through, because I wasn't brought up that way. I've had advantages that other people haven't. So how do you make sure that inclusivity means that, especially at a senior leadership level, how do you get people speaking at the table? And I think, Rebecca, one big learning for me is that in a lot of these things that companies do, we try to show our best self. Correct. We don't really show our authentic self. And I can sit here and give you an interview which makes me look pretty bad diversity and inclusion, or I can sit here and give you one that makes me look good. Correct. And both be right. I think we need to have more conversations where we're laying out the facts, laying out our challenges, and saying, how do we get better at this? Because it is an imperative, correct? Both from a moral or a business perspective.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps a good point to pick up again, Parmesh, just on, there's a policy side of this, but there is a softer side of this about leadership and, being just being a welcoming environment, being an accessible environment. I mean, can you talk a bit more about the work that you're doing in this space?
I describe it as a two-step process. The first is infiltration, where you just infiltrate the corporate world. It's easy to understand, right? I got hired at Godrej 9 years ago, and I'm still here. Yeah. And the longer that I'm here, the more I can do, right? So my process began with infiltration. And it's interesting because, as Nisa said, if you need people to speak up, right? You need change makers to infiltrate the system, and then you need them to raise their voices and say, how about this? Why don't we do this way? Have you thought about this in a different way or whatever, right? But the second and I think more useful technique that I use to describe what I do is this idea of cultural acupuncture. And it's a term that I borrowed from the Harry Potter Alliance, which is a great fan group. But I use the term to describe a range of experiments that I've been doing over the years, both. So I do cultural acupuncture inside Godrej as well as outside. So inside Godrej, it's a range of things, whether it's queering events like the Godrej Leadership Forum, right? We have more than 100 senior leaders across the Godrej group who assemble every year. It's the only time we actually, and we started doing this online, but until this year, it was the only time. So every CEO, every business head from all over the world, they gather in a room. It's a TED-like, 2-day conference, right? Now, when I have all of them together, I make sure that each of these is heavily, heavily queered up. Whether it's transgender activists talking to them, whether it's queer performers and their parents talking about acceptance, I don't leave them. Now, for 9 years, they've been seeing queer content. Obviously, it's going to change their mind a little bit, right? If I get a chance to go recruit for Godrej on any college campus, I'll talk about Godrej for maybe 3 minutes and talk about LGBTQ rights for 27 minutes. And what we've realized to our advantage is that really helps because I'm being authentic and speaking about something that matters to me, more people are joining us. So it's, it can be win-win in that way, right? So I think the acupuncture is finding what are the points of pressure and then, putting pressure on them, wherever it takes. Whether it's changing Godrej's HR policies, as Nisa said, whether it's, culture lab events. So doing whatever it takes, working with different group HR heads. But I think because of Godrej's unique position as, being a more than 120-year-old giant of Indian industry, I've had more impact in doing cultural acupuncture outside Godrej, but from Godrej's vantage point. So this transgender paper in 2018 that Nisa just spoke about, right? When we wrote it, when me and my colleague wrote it, and when we launched it, we had more than 100 people from corporate India, from so many different companies come to our campus and hear about trans rights. They might not have gone to any other company, but because it was Godrej and because we were standing up for something, they came to us. So I think using the Godrej story, being very transparent about the fact that we are on a journey and we may not have all the right answers, but this is a journey that we want to go on, helping other corporates, helping other organizations with whatever resources, we can, helping facilitate things, whether it's a job fair. Last year we had 3 incredible LGBTQ job fairs in the country. Imagine, this is a few years ago when people were being discriminated against. And now suddenly you enter a job fair where there's 100 stalls and 400 queer candidates, and all these people want to hire you, right? It's amazing, right? So we had a stall there and things like that, right? Or supporting film festivals, etc. I think, Godrej standing up for something has really helped change the conversation in the outside world and within, right? So I think it's a combination of both acupuncture within and acupuncture outside. And Nisa is, of course, always there. So doing a lot of this by shooting from Nisa's shoulders has certainly helped.
Yeah. I suppose a few things stand out there. The authenticity of the approach, the leadership matters. And as you say, it feels like it sounds like there's momentum in a way. I mean, is the corporate world, so it sounds like the corporate world is following, is joining. What are the challenges? Is it just about time, or kind of there must be some, resistance along the way?
I mean, there's an easy answer and there's a really serious answer, right? The first is, and Nisa has seen this at meetings, there's always some person at a meeting who, when you suggest anything radical or innovative, and this person tends to be a man, and in my experience, it tends to be an older man. This person will cough and say, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. Maybe you met this person at your meetings, so the first thing that you should do when you encounter this person is put your hand up and say, no, just no. Maybe you shouldn't play devil's advocate for a moment because, the devil has many advocates. I mean, that's my light answer, but I think it's extremely vital because there are so many good ideas that are sacrificed at this altar of devil's advocate nonsense. And the nonsense always comes from someone who is scared. It's someone who's older, who's scared, the world is changing around them, they don't know, so they want to maintain the status quo. If you remember, this is the person that played devil's advocate when you said women should have 6 months maternity leave. You know, any progressive measure, there's always this person who plays devil's advocate, right? And then some years later, that progressive measure becomes the norm, and you wonder, there were people opposing this. It's so common sense, right? So, I mean, I think the first thing that anyone should do is tell that person to stop. Say, no, don't play devil's advocate. But my resistance has actually come in converting intent to action. And that's the challenge, right? Because as I told you, corporate India, even within Godrej, you know, there's top level leadership buy-in. You know, everyone agrees that inclusion is something that makes sense, whichever way you look at it. But how do you go from senior leader in buy-in? How do you go down the line? Do you link it to compensation, and do you link it and you say, you know, if you don't be diverse in this way, you know, you're going to be paid less? How do you really make it translate all the way down the line to line managers? And because I want to see that intent translate into multiple things, including actually hiring of queer people. And as a queer person myself, who's benefited from having a job and the respect that it brings, I understand how important jobs are, right? So how do we get, and more so for trans people, so how do you convert all this good intent into actual job creation so that we can have more and more? I mean, I work on LGBTQ, but I think this would be true for any dimension of you know, diversity and inclusion. How do you get more people into the workplace so that all these other benefits of innovation, everything else can come? Otherwise, you'll just be talking and changing your policies and, you know, doing Pride Month events and putting rainbow flags, but, you know, the action is not taking place. So my challenge is in terms of, you know, translating intent to action.
No, that makes sense. Well, one last question, actually, just to bring back to Nisa. I mean, we're long-term investors, but there is generally a pretty strong fixation on short-term performance, and Godrej has had a tough couple of years operationally. Kind of, do you have any pushback or challenge with, you know, keeping your eyes on the long term? You know, keeping your eyes on the big picture. You know, particularly at the moment with COVID. I mean, you know, pandemic, lots of, you know, short-term measures. You know, how do you not deprioritize kind of commitments to the broader picture?
I actually really think they go hand in hand. And, you know, one of the things I've been talking about in the company right now is that we really need to sort of up our tough love quotient. So tough means that, you know, business is tough right now. You have to take inch by inch, you know, you have to serve your customers through lockdowns. You have to take market share if need be. You have to do, you know, do what matters and go where the consumer wants you to go. So, you know, the ask from us is very high. At the same time, you know, we are going through this medical, humanitarian, economic crisis. And I think this question on all these curves, correct? Climate change, we've seen Black Lives Matter. It is going to mean much more to people now, and organizations are really going to have to step up their game. So I think, you know, the love and that's the broader, that organizations need to do the right thing. But I think, you know, even on the day-to-day basis, we know now that it's not work from home, but it's live at work, and it's getting very hard for people, correct? It's the sort of mental fatigue that we're seeing people have and stuff. You know, we have to sort of, in these situations, and I'm not just stepping in for the mother with the child who's probably having the hardest time because they don't have childcare, and, you know, they're probably doing more of the house care than a male partner is. But if I can fix some of our ways of working or team working or being there for each other, for her, I fix it for the whole company, correct? It gives the whole company a sense of empathy and inclusiveness. So don't forget that it's work was built for men, correct? It was built in a very old-fashioned sort of way. But if we build a better way to work, it benefits men, women, all sorts of people, correct?
Yeah.
Because then it's designed for inclusivity, and then you're designing it sort of to do better. So I don't actually think that you can say, oh, you know, we'll come back to, you know, being there for sort of LGBTQ or women once COVID's over. You need to be there sort of much more. And actually, I think any company or any leader who wants to be remembered well for this time, because we will be remembered for what we do at this time, will need to be able to balance both of them. Because I actually think COVID-19 is telling us that none of this now is going to have the luxury of time to be put into sort of place. And I think it's also an opportunity for us to make things better, right? We know where they're not right. If we could all sort of work overnight from home, we know we're capable of the change very quickly. So I think
so it sounds like a real catalyst for change, for perhaps things that would have taken 5 or 6 years.
And you're seeing it, correct? You're seeing what's happening. Facebook stand on what's happening in the US. You're losing advertising dollars, and they're a big company. This is not going to make them break or anything like that. But you are going to see consumers, your own employees, ask for a higher level of care and authenticity, both towards them and to the outside world. Correct. So I think for companies like ours who do care about these things, actually this is the time to accelerate, not say, oh, we will come back after COVID.
No, exactly. Well, that's the positive, because obviously challenging time for the world at the moment. But I think, the positive optics of that is, galvanizing people around change across different dimensions of diversity. Now is the time. Well, brilliant.
Yeah.
We'll probably close there. So thank you both. Thank you, Parmesh. Thank you, Nisa. Always a pleasure to speak with you. We'll, as we know, this isn't a conversation or a one-hit fix. I'm sure we'll be old and grey and sitting in our respective rocking chairs on opposite sides of the globe, sending each other inspirational quotes. But it's true. I mean, I think, the one, that Kay, we were chatting about this on email, but this idea that, imagining a better world, the imagination shouldn't be about imagining something different, but imagining the reality you want to create. And I think that's a really strong message, and it links to Parmesh's work, because what you were saying as well. It's trying to disentangle yourself from the noise of today, and imagining if you were to start again, how would you want it to be, and not saying that that's impossible, but how everybody can play that part.